Hi everyone, my name is Anindita. Um, I work as a senior Sitecore developer, and I'm going to be talking about CI/CD pipelines in Azure DevOps for Sitecore on Azure PaaS, and with some specific instructions about Sitecore Managed Cloud as well. So right off the bat, I'm actually a backend developer, and I don't have as much extensive experience on Azure DevOps. So this was an experience where I got into this project and I was asked to set up the CI/CD pipelines for an existing code base. So based on my learnings and my experience through this process, I'm presenting these things to you. And if there, of a better way to do certain things that I've done, please feel free to let me know. I'm sure there is. And apart from this, I'd also like to mention that since this was a client instance as such, so I'm not able to show you a live demo, but I've taken as many screenshots as possible to show you all the steps and walk you through the steps for creating these kind of pipelines. So that being said, let's get started. So the build process. All right. So some prerequisites here or things you should kind of know before you get started. So the best way I think to get into this kind of requirement is that you have your local build running. So just think of this process basically as a new machine that you're trying to get the code base onto and then do a build of that and then deploy it onto an existing instance of Sitecore. So if you were to do this, what were the kind of steps that you would follow? And it's a good idea to do this on your local system because the same stuff you can try and mimic on the pipelines and on the server. So first thing you obviously need to do is get your front end and back end builds running on your local, and that's the best idea to do it. Back-end builds, you could have multiple ways that this is being achieved locally on your local system, on your local solution as such. And like I mentioned, this was an existing solution, so we were already using Helix publishing pipelines. But yeah, given the Helix structure nowadays, so there are three ways that I have seen this happening. One is using Gulp, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, which came from, I think it was around in Habitat as well. Then Helix Publishing Pipeline is where it dynamically uh, gathers the references of all the projects that you need to publish into a single project, and then you can just publish that one project, and the publishing properties are unified using the publishing targets file. So, and the third way is using team development for Sitecore or TDS, where you can create a deploy project and enable file deployment on that and add references to all the projects that you're trying to publish. Now, these three in themselves are pretty, vast. You can talk about this for a whole session of its own, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just mentioning what are the options that you might have when you're building locally, and you'll pretty much use the same that you're using on local on the server as well, on the server process as well. So that is the best idea as per me. Front-end build, I'm no front-end developer, so I usually reach out to the front-end team and they tell me how to do the build, and it's usually some sort of gulp command. So yeah, I would not speak too much else about it because I don't know that much. So this is it. Front-end builds is some kind of gulp command, and that's what we're going to see in the build pipeline as well. Now, in any release management tool that you go to, this process is split out into two. You have the build process and the deployment process. So in this case, in Azure DevOps, you can see that there's pipelines, which actually has the build pipelines, and the release, which has the release or deployment pipeline. So this does the build, while this here does the deployment. So that is the basic two things. Two things that we're going to speak about, and these are separated out as well in the coming slides. A note here about Sitecore configurations, because we know that based on environment, we do have specific, environment-specific variables and settings and stuff. So the ways to achieve that in the old school way of doing things was config transforms. And like I mentioned, I was working on an existing project, and it had a whole lot of configuration files, all with a bunch of transforms on them, and so it was easier for me to go on with the config transforms and deal with how to deploy them than rock the boat and change everything all over. So yeah, I would not suggest going with config transforms if you're using a new instance, because there's a much better way of doing that using roles. But in case of config transforms, so you can see here, basically for a given configuration, you'll have multiple transform files, and and I had a bunch of build configurations in Visual Studio corresponding to these transforms. And so to deal with this in the pipeline as such, in the build pipeline, I had to create these configuration specific builds. So every time for each configuration, I had a separate build in place. And so this is how I was dealing with it. You can see that there's, like I mentioned, I was using Helix Publishing Pipeline. So it's just building this one deploy project, which had the dynamic references to everything else. And I had to mention the configuration specifically here for each of the builds to get the artifact as such, or the output as such, build output based on each of the environments in place. So this is how you would ideally deal with it. But yeah, if this is something that you can change, I would definitely recommending changing it and you going to Sitecore roles and custom environment definitions. So in that case, everything is driven off of the role or the environment, which is defined on web.config. And usually we don't deploy web.config anyhow. So that is something that is fixed on environment to environment basis. And you have all of the settings going over during the deployment. There's no filtering out during the deployment as such, but when the site spools up, Sitecore is going to load up the appropriate settings and configuration based on the role or the environment that is set in the web.config app setting. So this is definitely a much cleaner and better way to do things. If you have an option, I would recommend going with that. Another thing going in that you would want to have in place is or think about is your branching strategy. So on each environment, I would say at the very least you should use a different branch for deploying to each environment. It keeps things clean and helps if you ever need to kind of refer what's there where. And so that is something that is good to know going in, because when you create the build pipeline, you will need to mention what branches it needs to pull the code from. Then the next thing is continuous integration, and this is something that you can configure at any point, but it's good to know and good to think of right from the beginning. So in my case, like we wanted to set up the automated builds on every check-in into develop, but we didn't want to do that for say production. When you have a merge into production, I wanted to have the control to manually kick it off. So things like that, what you'd like to automate and what you'd like to leave manual. So that is something that is good to decide right off the bat, but obviously it can be configured at a later time and changed at any point that you'd like. So we spoke about transforms. Let's get into creating the build pipelines now. So excuse me, this is the screenshot from Azure DevOps as such. So you can go into pipelines, create a new pipeline. You get an option of you need to connect your repository to your Azure instance because it's going to pick up the code from your repository. One thing I'd like to mention here is that by default, these pipelines, it actually shows up in a scripting language called YAML, in a scripting language, called YAML. And unless you're really familiar with YAML, I would not, recommend going with that. There's a much easier user-friendly GUI kind of interface. So as someone who is not overly familiar with YAML, I think I found it a lot easier to go with that. So that's what is highlighted here using this classic editor. So yeah, you connect to your repository. In my case, it was in DevOps itself, and then select the branch that you'd like. And next thing is you get a bunch of templates here, pre-filled templates that you can choose from, and this is usually based on the code in the repository that you selected. It suggests what kind of template might be more useful to you. I just go with empty job because I'd rather know what's going into it. And once you've created that job, you can create tasks on, you can basically add tasks, and you can have multiple of them in a given build pipeline. So when you try to add these tasks, you'll actually have a search bar out here on the right side, which is missing. But anyways, so you can search for different tasks and add them to the build pipeline. Now here's a sample of a build pipeline as such. So in the previous step we saw that you can add these steps here. So here there are a bunch of added steps, and as you can see, this pretty much corresponds to things that we do when we try to build and deploy on given on a blank system. Usually what we do is we install NuGet, and the package sources are defined on nuget.config. So here as well it looks at nuget.config in the repository root folder, and according to that it configures the packages. So you'd want to most likely include your Sitecore NuGet package source, because I'm pretty sure all projects have references to the Sitecore NuGet packages at this point. So yeah, and that is something that is done in the NuGet installer step, and then there's a restore. And in my case, I'm just deploying this one single project which uses Helix publishing pipelines. So one thing to note here is that during the build process, what is the actual point to it? So what we are trying to do is build our code and also get the build output. And we need to get this build output in a certain location from which the release pipeline or the deployment process is going to pick up, and they're going to take those artifacts and deploy it on the server based on what you configure. So this is how the task is separated between the build pipeline and the release pipeline. So in this case, you can see that the MS build is happening, and we are publishing all the artifacts or the build output into this location, which is given by this variable artifact staging directory. So there are actually a bunch of variables that are available to use here, and I think I'd included, yeah, so there's a link to that. Microsoft has a nice reference to all the different variables that are available to use in pipelines, so you can take a look at that if you need. But in my case, I've just used the artifact staging directory. And then you need to publish this artifact onto the Azure pipeline or onto a location where the deploy pipeline can pick it up. So that's what you see in this step. So I'm publishing it, and I've given the same location, that this is the path from where you have to publish the artifacts and publish it to Azure pipelines. Now when we look at the release pipelines, we'll see that the source is given as Azure pipelines, and that's where it's going to pick up the artifacts from. So we spoke about continuous integration initially. So this is where you would set things up in the triggers tab here while creating the build pipeline. So you can enable continuous integration and mention that on checking into which branch you would like to trigger the builds, and you have various options for that. You can also schedule regular builds. So in case someone cancels a particular build after check-in for some reason, whatever reason be it, so we still have a daily build. So this is process that you'd like to define, and which is what I said, that the process will vary from project to project as such based on your business needs. Now I've created the build and I ran the build. It said it succeeded. How do I know it actually worked? So if you go into the instance of build, after running it, you'll see this job section in the bottom, and you'll see the jobs that are available as a part of the build pipeline. So in this case, you can see QA, backend, CD, and CM. So this actually corresponds to the jobs that are there in the build pipeline here: QA, backend, CD, and CM. So once you go into this, you can see the actual steps of this particular job, what all it did, and this corresponds to what we saw in the previous screen as well. And you can also have a link to the artifact. You can go into the artifact, click into that, and you can see actually what is the artifact that got stored onto the Azure pipeline. Now this is quite handy, because you get to see firsthand exactly what got created out of the build, and this is what is going to be available for deployment. If something is wrong here, it's obviously going to get deployed in the wrong manner. once it gets to the deployment pipeline. So this is a good place to validate things. Now, a quick glance at the sample front-end build. So like I mentioned, I don't really know too much about this. It's usually front-end gives you steps that you need to do this, execute all of this, and you'll get the output in this folder. You copy it from here and deploy it. So that is usually the kind of instructions that I get from front-end. This screenshot here is just to let you know that you have different Microsoft Microsoft specified tasks available for each of these steps, things like node installer, npm, gulp, grunt. So you have different the tasks available readily that you can use for doing the front-end build as well. Let's look at the release pipeline now. So how would you create a release pipeline? So in the same way in Azure DevOps, you go into releases, create a new one, then select a template or select an empty job, which is what I've done, and you see an empty release pipeline here. So this is the blank pipeline as such, and you see two parts to it. One is the artifacts. Now in this section, you choose that which are the builds from where you need the artifacts. So obviously you have to choose, you have to give an input to this deployment process, saying that these are the builds which are giving me the artifacts that you need to work with and you need to deploy. So this column over here with artifacts is where you're defining what input is available to this pipeline. And then in the stages, you're telling it what to do with these artifacts and where to put it and how to deploy it and things like that. So that's what these two columns are for. Now, building a release pipeline. So like I mentioned, for adding the artifact, in this case, when you click on add an artifact, you get an option to select a build, and it is going to show you what are the artifacts you have available. So that's how you add artifacts to a given build pipeline. And then in stages, when you try to add a stage, you'll get again a pre-built list of tasks which you can choose from. So in this case, we're going to be closely looking at Azure App Service Deploy, because like I mentioned in the beginning, this is about the Sitecore setup, which is or the deployment is done on Azure PaaS. So we're going to deploy to an app service directly. Now, I had mentioned a little bit that we're going to be talking about Sitecore Managed Cloud, and this project that I was working on was on Sitecore Managed Cloud. So there was one additional step that I needed to do to be able to access that app service which is managed by Sitecore Managed Cloud. So we basically need a connection at this point between our DevOps pipeline and the app service. Now this app service is managed by Sitecore, so we can't just log in and get access to it. There's an additional step that we need to do to get certain values from Sitecore to be able to establish that connection. So I'll just go over that quickly. So you need to raise a Sitecore ticket in case you're working with Sitecore Managed Cloud. And this is the caveat, this is the disclaimer here. So if you're using Sitecore Managed Cloud, you go into the Sitecore support and you have to create a service request, not a support case, a service request in access management to get access to Azure Service Principal. So to create this, you select your account. So obviously you need to have the client license associated with your Sitecore account. And these are the values that you fill in here, trying to get access to the Service Principal. You pretty much get a response within the hour. It's quite quick. I think it's automated in some way, but yeah, they send us back a response giving us these values, a bunch of keys that we need to use to set up the connection. One thing I'd like to mention is that these names are a little misleading because they don't exactly match the form that you need to fill out in Azure DevOps. So, but I'm going to show that to you shortly. So you have like this application client ID and the tenant ID and things like that. So, okay. Once you have this response, you are going to go into Azure DevOps and create a service connection, which is what is going to be used to connect Azure DevOps to the web app. All right, so you go into project settings and then go into service connections and create a new service connection. Use Azure Resource Manager and then say authentication method is service principal, and then this is the form that you need to fill out. So subscription ID and Sitecore and subscription name are available in your Azure portal, so you should have that available with you. Now, this is the dicey part that I was talking about, and yeah, I mentioned dicey because I actually messed it up, and it took me 2 days to figure out what to put where, because there are a bunch of other keys as well that they give in the Sitecore ticket response. So yeah, I messed that up a little bit, but anyways, so yeah, service principal ID is supposed to be the application client ID, and then the service principal key is the service principal password or API key as mentioned in Sitecore's response. Tenant ID is thankfully tenant ID. So yeah, once you're done with this and you're able to verify successfully, it means you have established the connection and you can save this. Now going back to the deployment pipeline or the release pipeline, once you have selected, you have this service connection created, you can proceed with the actual deployment configuration. So for each job in the release pipeline, you can actually select what part of the artifacts it is going to be working with. So this will impact the amount of time it takes because it's going to download the artifacts accordingly. When you have a job like, which is just doing an application, an app service restart, you don't really need any artifacts in that case. So you can uncheck all this. Now the list of available artifacts is based on what you had configured initially in the artifacts column of the release pipeline. So from that you can select whether you want everything or something or part of it or nothing at all. So you can select that in the agent menu here. So in this case, since I'm doing a CD deploy, I only need the CD artifact, and that's the only thing that's going to be downloaded for this job. One quick mention here. So the agent pool is Azure Pipelines, and one second. Okay, so the next step here is the actual deployment configuration. So the service connection that we created, that gets selected here because now we are talking about the target of where it is going to be deploying. So the connections type is ARM, which is what we had created, and you can select the Azure subscription. So here is where the list of service connections is going to show up. So once you select that, your app service is going to show up here. And if you're deploying to a slot, then you have to fill in these additional details, which we'll talk about shortly. But yeah, that is that. And so the stuff that we had put in the Azure pipeline, as in the build artifacts, so you can actually choose which part of that artifact is going to get deployed. So here I'm selecting that, okay, from this default working directory, select this folder structure. So go into this folder, and that is where the artifacts are there. So it's going to take everything inside this particular folder, and you can definitely see, or validate this path that you're giving based on the artifacts that we were able to see. Where is it gone? Hang on. Here. Yeah, so in the screenshot you can see these artifacts, right? So this will be the path that you're trying to select and say that, okay, fine, from this BE, QA, CM, or CD. So inside this I have my app config and everything. So this all needs to go into my webroot folder. So that's exactly what is selected here. So this is going to be a drop down, and it will let you select from the folder structure of the artifact as such. So you select that and it gets deployed onto the webroot. Now what if you don't want to move it to the webroot and you want to deploy it to a particular folder on your server? So that's what this virtual application is about. In case of the backend build where we are deploying the Sitecore code, everything goes into the webroot folder as such. But in my case, when I was doing the front-end deployment, so I needed the front-end assets to go into a particular folder, a subfolder within the webroot. So in that case, I needed to create a virtual application. So where would you create that? In Azure portal, you go into your web app or your app service, and then configuration, path mappings, and create a new virtual directory. So this is pretty much similar to you creating a virtual directory in IIS, except that since this is an app service, you don't have IIS, and this is where you do it. So that's pretty much it. So you create a virtual path and you mention what physical path it corresponds to, and uncheck directory because that is checked by default, and you need this to be a virtual application for the deployment to work. And whatever virtual path you have mentioned here, that is what you are going to paste into this virtual application input. So once you give that, it's going to deploy to this folder that you have configured in physical path here. So that is something that's good to know. Now we'll move on to a sample release pipeline. So this is a production pipeline that I had in place, and I just wanted to bring it up because there are different processes that are happening as a part of this. So in this case, we have artifacts from the front end and the back end build, and that's what is configured here, which is what I mentioned. And in this right hand column is where we have the actual build process happening. I have 2 rows here. One is for the CD deployment, one is for the CM deployment. The only difference being I do a restart for the CM deployment in between because I was actually facing issues that needed this only for CM, not for CD. So yeah, we'll just look at the CD deployment because it's pretty much the same except this restart. So what's with this slot stuff? So yeah, let's talk about zero downtime deployment at this time. So for achieving zero downtime deployment, we are using something called deployment slots, and we're going to be speaking about this. We'll look at more screenshots on how to use that and how to get it up and running as well. So what deployment slots essentially is, it's pretty much another app service or a duplicate app service that you're creating, and it has the same set of files. So in my case, how I'm using it is when I do a deployment, I start this duplicate app service, I deploy my code to it, I validate that it looks good, and then I just swap it out with the production instance. So in this case, I have a deployed to, or rather an updated and a validated app service, which is just instantly getting swapped without any downtime, and Azure guarantees that there will be no dropped requests, no dropped sessions when a swap happens. So that is something that you can use to ensure zero downtime. And so this is the process that I'm usually following, and that's what you see here. So the CD slot, the slot, or the the duplicate instance, or the secondary slot in this case, it's usually stopped because you don't want it eating up your resources. So when I do a deployment, it automatically starts the slot. It deploys the backend code and then the front end code to the slot. Then it warms up the CD instance on this secondary slot, and what this does is this basically has this marketplace task, which I'll talk about. It hits a bunch of URLs, pre-configured URLs of your website, and it does multiple attempts at it, and it basically does that first load after build, which is usually very slow, and sometimes it throws errors based on how long it takes for your application to warm up. So you can automate all of that so that till your site is up and till some crucial business important pages get loaded up and get cached into your server. So you can automate all of that and basically warm up your site so that once this is done, the next time you hit it, you don't have to sit and watch the spinner spinning for ages. So that has been automated. And then if you see here, there's like a small tick mark here in this case. So this is a process that we have added for waiting for approval. So it's a pre-deployment trigger as such, and a prerequisite. So I've set up an approval process here, which I have to approve because I don't want this whole thing to go off in one in one shot. I want to have the opportunity to validate that the deployment looks good, and only after that I approve the swap of the slots. So that has been configured here as well. I'll show you screenshots of where to do that. And yeah, a note to add here, obviously your secondary slot or your deployment slot has its own URL that is going to be used, that you can access to validate the site and to see that everything, all your changes look good. One small update that you will have to make, or you'll have to ensure that in your site definition, you also include the URL of this secondary slot. That's the only update that you need to make with regard to being able to access that secondary slot. So as you can see, there's a lot of these things which are a lot of these operations, like starting a slot and stopping a slot and swap and things like that. These are all actually done using an Azure App Service Managed task. So this is a Microsoft specific task, and that's what is going to be used to achieve all these management kind of tasks that we are doing. And what you're seeing on screen is the swap task that we have in place. So we mention which app service and what is the name of the slot that you'd like to swap out, and you swap with production. And the second step here is actually to just stop the secondary instance once the swap is completed. We spoke about zero downtime deployments, and that uses deployment slots like I mentioned. So where do you create those? You go into your app service for which you're trying to create a slot, and you have this option called deployment slots. You can add a slot here and you can swap it out manually as well, but in our case we have automated that in the pipeline. But yeah, so you add a new slot, which is easy enough, but when the slot is created, it is actually blank. It does not have any files on it. So you obviously don't want to go back and start installing Sitecore on it, as all you need to happen is it should pretty much be a clone of the current app service, files that you have in place. So how do you achieve this? I would recommend the best way to do it is to restore from a backup of this app service itself, which is the primary, slot in this case. Since I was using an Azure Managed Cloud, Sitecore Managed Cloud instance, I did have regular backups already configured, but the automatic backups did not work so well for me to restore from into a deployment slot. So yeah, just a tip here, please use a custom backup. In case you don't have custom backup set up, please do a custom backup on your own and then try to restore from that. So you go onto the app service which you are creating a slot for, go into the backup section, and if you don't have stuff set up automatically, you can just click on backup now, and once that backup shows up here, you can restore from it. There's actually like a restore button next to each of these backups. Yeah, so that's hidden behind this blade. So once you click on that, this blade shows up, and you can choose the destination. So in this case, I'm choosing the secondary deployment slot that I have created, and you have settings for it, and hit restore. It takes a few minutes, and you can see that in the logs as such, but yeah, around 15 minutes or so it took for me. And once that was done, I just needed to make sure that the site definition had the URL of this secondary slot as such for Sitecore to work as expected. But again, just make a note that these automatic backups don't work. You need to have a full-on custom backup for the restore to work. We spoke about one is creating a pre-deployment condition of approvals. So that was the case in the example that we saw, where I wanted to leave this final swap conditional to an approval being provided. So it gave me the chance to validate these things before doing the final swap. So this is where you would do it. You would click on any stage. You can just click on this on the left side, which is pre-deployment conditions. You can also give post-deployment conditions, but yeah, I'm just talking about pre in this case. So here you can select approvals. You can also add in delays if you need using gates. And another thing to mention here is the pre-deployment trigger. So you saw this diagram, which kind of looked like a flow diagram, but this is not something that you are creating using drag and drop and things like that. It is generated automatically, and what it uses to do that is how you select the triggers. So in this case, like you can see that the swap CM slot, it has been given a trigger as it is supposed to deploy after warm up CM stage. So that's how it's been configured, and that's why you see this as coming after the warm-up CM stage. Now you can also select multiple stages here. In that case, what it's going to do is it's going to wait for all the the prerequisites to get done, and only then it moves on to this. So if in case, in this case, if I said this depended on warm-up CM and also some other task, so in that case it would kind of give another connection here. And the initial stages, especially I'll show it here. Yeah, these initial stages, which are the first stages for this deployment process. So in this case, what you do is you say that it happens after release. So once so these will be the initial entry stages of the deployment. So that's how you kind of configure this flow diagram that you saw on the screen. A note I'd like to mention here is about the marketplace task that I used for warming up the website, as I mentioned. So I had to add a marketplace task in this place, and this was the first time I actually did that. There was an issue I ran into when I searched for something like the smoke test, and I got this. I went in to get it for free, and then I reached this page, but instead of reaching this page, I just got a 500 error. So I kept thinking there was something wrong with this particular, marketplace task as such, but turns out I didn't have access. So, excuse me. So if you see something like that, it pretty much means you don't have access. So you need to request your admin for it. So yeah, once you've got access and you hit the link here, you come to this Visual Studio Marketplace page where you can select which organization you want to add this task to. So in my case, I'm a part of multiple projects, and this particular project is it was also a part of the list, which is what I selected and requested to get added. So in that case, once that is done, this task is going to be available for all the pipelines of that particular project. And when you want to add it, so you can just search for smoke test, and you might need to refresh here, but it's going to show up as the available task as such when you're trying to add things to the agent job. This particular task I found quite useful actually, because what it let me do is, like I mentioned, I set up a bunch of URLs of my site which are of the most business importance as such, and I was able to configure that it should hit these pages every 5 minutes for 3 times till the site comes up. And so that served as a good automated warm up of the site, instead of me having to go and load up the page and look at the 503 error and refresh again and bite my nails through it. So I didn't have to do any of that, and all of that was automated. So that's that about marketplace tasks as well. Yeah, so this was pretty much my experience in trying to automate the pipelines for a Sitecore project, which was hosted on Azure PaaS, and it also used Sitecore. It was managed by Sitecore Managed Cloud as such. So yeah, if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If anything you think can be done in a better way than what I've done here so far, again, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much for listening.